Okay, so the joke says that the worst type of torture in Gehenna is, and there's various versions of it. You have many cigars without a lighter. You have lashon hara without any names. So I think one version of it that I could relate to is you have a very comfortable bed with no clock in the room. And you wake up and you have no idea. Is it 2 o'clock in the morning and you can turn back over and go back to sleep? Or is it, are you late for davening? Are you late for something you need to get up for? It's happened to me. So last Friday night, I got a knock on the door from someone who has just recently moved into a new house, so kind of still living out of boxes. And they're going to sleep Friday night, and there's no clock in the room. And he has a clock on the wall in the living room. So can he take the clock off the wall in the living room and bring it into his room? That was the question. Now, at face value, I didn't see any reason why not, because, and in order to explain this, we need to give some introductions to principles in Muktza, in the laws of Muktza. One more preface, I should say, is also that I did spend actually a tremendous amount of time going through this sugya. And one of the challenges in this sugya is twofold. First of all, clocks and different devices used for telling time changed drastically over the years, and it's often difficult to determine precisely which type of device a given posek is referring to, and based on that to apply those to apply what he's saying to contemporary clocks. That's a second aspect of the same issue is that often you'll have within the poskim, for example, a later posik discussing the words of an earlier posik about clocks, but it turns out that the later posik, he's referring to the clocks that he had, and let's say Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he's talking about clocks, and he's talking about the Maharil, and we're going to get to all of this, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden had no tools to figure out which clocks the Maharil had. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden is familiar with whatever clocks they had in his day and age, and perhaps she's assuming that the Maharil is talking about the same thing, whereas nowadays with the tools that we have, we may be able to determine that that's in fact not the case. So there's a lot of difficulty in pinning down exactly what each and every pasuk is referring to. And perhaps we'll touch upon more of that soon, and maybe even some of the feedback of today's class, if the recording gets some good attention from people who are more knowledgeable in these things, will lead to a follow-up class where we can further clarify some of these details. Now, going back to the prefacing the laws of Muktza, a keli, Shulchan Aruch uses the word keli, Halach uses the word keli. A keli is often translated as a utensil, although I don't like that translation because utensil is not a word that anybody ever uses in day-to-day life, and so it's not really a very helpful necessarily term. If I had to give you one word translation for the word keli, it would probably be tool. But it's not only a tool. A piece of furniture, a chair, a table is also a keli. So, but it's an item that has a usage, is a keli. Now, within kelim, a keli is okay. Within kelim, we could divide them into a keli shemalachti laheter and a keli shemalachti leiser. A keli shemalachti laheter means it's something whose purpose is permissible on Shabbat. So, for example, a chair is a tool or an item that's purpose is to sit on it. Sitting is something which is permissible to do on Shabbos, and so it's a kli shemalachti laheter. It's a permissible item for Shabbos. A kli shemalachti leiser is, for example, a pen. A pen, you're not allowed to write on Shabbos, so it's a utensil, it's a tool. Shemalachti leiser, that's purpose is something that's forbidden. Now, you're allowed to move. A keli shemalachti laheter you're allowed to use for any purpose. So, for example, if a chair is outside and it's going to rain or snow and I'm scared that the chair is going to get ruined, I'm allowed to bring the chair inside. Obviously, we're not talking about carrying on Shabbos. Let's say it's enclosed in the Erev. You're allowed to bring the chair inside. Whereas a kli shemalachti leiser, something which is purpose on Shabbos, is forbidden, so then you're not allowed to move it on Shabbos unless it's the tzorich gufay or mekayme. So let's go back to our example of a pen. I'm not allowed to, if the pen is outside and I'm scared it's going to get ruined from the snow, I'm not allowed to bring it inside. That's Muktza. But if I need the pen either l'tzoyrech gufay or mekayme, that means mekayme is, let's say the pen is on the table and I need to sit over here and put my sitter down to daven. So then I'm allowed to take the pen and move it away because I need the place that the pen is occupying. And then the second thing is l'tzoyrech gufay means I need the pen itself for a permissible activity. Let's say I want to use the pen to scratch my back. So scratching your back is permissible on Shabbos. So I'm allowed to use a pen. Um, I'm allowed to move a pen for that purpose. So coming back to our question about the clock on Friday night, my first thought is that a clock could either be a klisha malachta leheter or leisser, and Shulchan Aruch says it's leisser, and we'll get to that soon, why that might be. But even if a clock is a klisha malachta leisser, it's for a forbidden Shabbos activity, he needs the clock, l'tzoyrech gufa, he needs the clock in his room to use the clock for permissible purpose on Shabbos. Telling the time is permissible on Shabbos. And so what could possibly be the problem moving the clock into his room? That was my initial thought. However, I then looked it up in the Mishnah Berurah. And so the Shulchan Aruch says that a clock is a klisha malachta l'isur. We're going to get to that soon. And the Shulchan Aruch, actually the word the Shulchan Aruch uses for clocks, the words of the Shulchan Aruch are Ma shemoira al hashois, something that shows on the hours, shekoirin, which is called rilozo. Rilozo is the Hebrew transliteration of the Spanish word, and in Spanish, a watch, a clock, a watch is called, I don't know how to pronounce this, but it's reloj. So that is the generic word for a clock or a watch that the Shulchan Aruch is using over here, and it says ben shul shel choil, whether it's a sand clock, which the Mishnah Berurah explains means that you basically have sand going from the top to the bottom of the thing, and it has certain lines on the device, on the item, that when the sand comes to a certain time, you know what time it is. So then, where is it? Bein shul shel min acher, or if it's a different type of, not sand, something else. Yesh lehistapic imutar l'taltaloi. So it is questionable whether or not it's permissible to move it. The Ramah says that the minhag is to forbid moving the clock on Shabbos. We'll see soon why and where the Ramah gets that from. On that, the Mishnah Berurah says like this. He says that Zegelach Shalanu, our Zegelach. Zeger is Yiddish for a watch or a clock. Now, the word Zeger actually literally means a scale, or at least originally it meant a scale, and that's called the old clocks. They worked with a system of scales. In fact, very old clocks didn't even display any time. The way you told the time was by listening to the sound of how many, it was the weights would. The mechanism was designed that at 10 o'clock it would do 10 bells or whatever it was, and so on. Actually, in English as well, the word clock originally means a bell, about the noise of the bell. That's what it means, because originally the clock wasn't about looking at it and being able to know what time it was, but it was the sound that the clock made. So the Mishnah Berurah starts off by saying that Zegelach Shalano, or Zeges Shalano, where's the Lashon, are permissible to move, but that's only the ones that go in your pocket. Now, again, nowadays it's not so common to have pocket watches, but you know what a pocket watch is? It's like a little round thing, and it has a chain, and you tie it to the button of your shirt or your vest, and you keep it in your pocket, right? So those ones, says the Mishnah Berurah, are permissible. And then he says, a Vandur. Now, what does Vandur mean? So Vand is Yiddish or German for wall, Wand, right? And Ur is hour. So the wall hour, right, a wall clock is forbidden to move on Shabbos unless it's l'tzoyrech mekoymai, unless it's for the place of the clock. So if the clock is in my way, if I need that space, then the Mishnah Berurah says I'm allowed to move it. But that's all. So what do I mean? Like usually, if you could move something for the place, you could also move it l'tzorech gufay. So I start looking, and I see that the Piskei Teshuvos, who's a contemporary sefer on these halachas, and he says, yeah, it's only, he has a whole thing. We'll try to get to it soon, But basically, he says, no, you're not allowed to move the clock. So I was a little bit confused. I couldn't see why. And that's where I started from, deep dive into the whole sugya. And now, after all that introduction, rewind all the way to the beginning. The first source that says that talks about clocks on Shabbos is the Maharil. Not the Shuvas Maharil, and the Beis Yosef brings it in the Beis Yosef in the commentary in the Torah, and this is what he's referring to in the Shulchan Aruch. It says like this: Tiltul hashois, to move the hours. That means to move the clock. So I heard that people forbade it. Why did they forbid it? Because it's a measurement tool. Measuring is forbidden on Shabbos. You're not allowed to measure things on Shabbos. So because the clock is a tool that's made for measuring, so then therefore it is forbidden, it's considered a forbidden utensil on Shabbos. And even though measuring time isn't that literally like measuring, it's not the same as measuring an item or anything like that. Nevertheless, it can be compared to measuring an item. And the Godel Hadoir already said, so basically, you're right that logically we could differentiate between a measuring device that measures an actual item versus something that's measuring time, which is an abstract concept. Nevertheless, the minhag is to forbid it. And then he says, and this that you heard, he's writing this letter to somebody, this that you heard about the sand and the sections. Now, the way the Beis Yosef quotes this, he says, whatever the case is, you heard that the problem with the clock was the sand. So you're trying to say, so it seems like you're saying, I'm sorry, the sand or the chulius. So he says you're referring to a clock that you put it in the shade, and somehow where the sun and where the shade shows, that tells you the time. But either way, I don't know why you think that makes a difference. Perhaps it's even worse because you're measuring the actual shade or shadow. So I think what the Maharil is saying is like this. Look, logically we could perhaps differentiate and say that measuring time is not even a thing, and it's totally okay. However, in practice, the minhag is that we consider a clock like a measuring tool, and therefore it is a kli shemalachti le'isser that's forbidden to use on Shabbos. In other words, the purpose is a forbidden activity on Shabbos, and therefore in our paradigm of our chair and our pen, we're talking here about the pen. Can I please ask that people put their phone on silence? It's quite distracting. So then he says, perhaps those who forbade clocks were referring to clocks were referring specifically to the types of clocks that are measuring a thing. They're measuring the sand. They're measuring where the shade goes on the clock. Now again, shade is less tangible than sand, but perhaps it's more tangible than time, because at the end of the day, it's something that you could, in today's talk, you could say you could take a photo of it, right? So perhaps that's the reason why you would forbid a clock. And yeah, that would even be worse than measuring time. But at the end of the day, the Maharil has a problem with both, right? Now, how is all this halacha? So the Ramah says the minhag is like the Maharil. How does this halacha summarized in the Paskim? For example, the way the Alter Rebbe brings this halacha in Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Ches Sif Peches, is a clock, is a klisha menachti le'isser. So you're not allowed to move it unless it's l'tzorech gufay mukayme. If you need the place that the clock occupies, if you need the clock itself, l'tzorech gufay, then it's permissible. L'tzorech gufay could mean also to use it as a paperweight. Yeah, it could also be l'tzorech gufay. I need the clock itself. That's not the purpose of the clock, but I want to use it for that would be okay. Now, what about what we call an analog, right? Like the type of clocks that we have that display the time. Now, if you go with what the Maharil mentioned at the end, that the reason why the clock is considered a measuring device is because it's measuring the sand and measuring the shade, so then this type of clock is not measuring anything. Versus if you go with the what seems to be the main gist of the Maharil, that the issue is measuring time, and then this clock is also measuring time. It's quote unquote telling the time. Now, on the one hand, the way most of the poskim bring this halacha, the Magen Avraham, the Alter Rebbe, the Mishnah Berurah, is they say both. They say the domilim didas hasman oilam didas hatzeil. This device is used for measuring, whether measuring the time or measuring the shade or the sand, and so therefore, so accordingly, it would seem that this clock would be forbidden. However, there are those poskim who we're going to see soon who they seem to say that no, that the whole that the issue is specifically when you're measuring something tangible, just one that's measuring time would not be an issue of measuring, and therefore would be a kli shemalachti leheter. Okay, so where we're at right now is that a clock, thinking of a clock like we have on the wall today, or not necessarily on the wall, it could be like a table clock. Any clock, digital, analog, whatever it is, logically, one could very much make the argument that it's a kli shemalachti leheter, that it's like the chair. But again, I'm using the chair pen mashal, so for people who are not familiar with the Hebrew words, it's an easier thing to go to. But the minhag is to treat it like a kli shemalachti le'iser, like the pen, and therefore you could only move it if you need either the space or the item itself to use, let's say, as a paperweight. Now, here is where I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench into the wheel over here. And that is, I said earlier that sometimes it's difficult to determine if the later poskim understand which precisely device the earlier poskim were talking about. This requires some further research, but it may be that the earlier poskim will talk about the clock being a measuring device, and therefore it's a kli shemalachti le'iser, are talking of something that measures increments of time, something similar to a stopwatch or a timer, what's it called, a chronograph, that measures units of time. Versus, and that's what they say. Look, you're measuring an hour, you're measuring half an hour, then that's something that's forbidden. Versus something that just tells the time, that might be permissible. Now, my friend Eli Poltrak, he said he thinks that that's what the Alter Rebbe is talking about, because later on in Siman Shidla B'Ches, the Alter Rebbe says that you're not allowed to wind up a clock on Shabbos, which is also a whole. We touched on this. It's a whole machlekes if you're allowed to wind up a clock on Shabbos. Alter Rebbe says you're not allowed to, and the reason you're not allowed to is because he says it's mashmiya koil, because you're creating a noise, creating a sound. Now, if measuring time was a kli shemalachti le'iser, then regardless of the sound, you're not allowed to wind up the clock on Shabbos because you're doing something forbidden. You're measuring time. And it would be a kli shemalachti le'iser, and you wouldn't be allowed to touch it and move it because it would be Muktza. And now so there may be a strong implication there that when the Alter Rebbe says here that a clock is a kli shemalachti le'iser because it's a measuring device, and again, the Alter Rebbe is quoting the Maharil, he may be referring not to something that tells the time, but from something that measures units of time. In which case, the result would be that an analog is certainly a kli shemalachti leheter, like the chair, not like the pen. Okay. Let's move on to something that all the poskim talk about, not the Alter Rebbe, but many poskim after the Alter Rebbe talk about this, a sha'in kiss, a watch, a pocket watch. Again, I think nowadays a lot of people don't wear anything because you have smartphones and all that, cell phones, etc. But certainly when I was growing up, most people wore a wristwatch. So again, we could research exactly when wristwatches became very common, but in the poskim who we're talking about, the most common thing was a pocket watch. And all the poskim pretty much say that the minhag is that we use that we pocket watches are totally fine on Shabbos. And it's like, well, it seems strange because Shulchan Aruch says a clock is a kli shemalachti le'iser, so why is everybody using a pocket watch? And some, like for example, the Muktza shekel, which is one of the classic commentaries on the Magen Avraham, he says I don't really know what the heter is. The reason to forbid a regular clock would be just the same to forbid a pocket clock. Nevertheless, go and see what Amid Debar. You could either translate that as what the people are doing or what the outside people are, whichever way. Shakol haGedolim v'chachmei Yisrael. All the Gedolim and all the sages of Israel, they all permit and they all practice using pocket watches on Shabbos. So, what do we make of all of this? So, the first and the most prominent Pasuk to discuss all of this is the Ramash in the Tshuvas Panim Iris, and this is quoted in the Shar Tshuva on the Shulchan Aruch. So, in the Panim Iris, you have both the question and the answer. So the person writing to the Ramash, he says that perhaps the reason why the Poskim, the Maharil, forbade the watch was because he was talking about a sand or a watch with sand or with the shade, that you have to do something to measure the time. You turn the clock over, you place it in the sun or in the shade, and you see where things are up to. Whereas a clock like this, that just displays the time, you're not doing anything, it's just displaying it, so therefore it should be okay. Now again, he's not differentiating here between a clock that measures increments of time versus one that displays the time of the day, and I don't know that in the time, my hunch is that in the time of Maharil, perhaps clocks that displayed the time of the day were not yet existed, or certainly were not yet common. I think he might also be talking about something that measures units of time. But either way, they were already advanced, and they weren't necessarily measuring units of times with sand. It was different devices. Whatever the case is, I'm not 100% sure about that. But the person writing to the Maharil says, to the Panim to Maramash, he says two things. First of all, it could be that the whole minhag was to forbid something that you have to do something. You have to turn over the sand timer. You have to put the clock into the shade, versus a clock that just sits and does nothing and it displays the time. That would not be considered medida. And then he goes a step further and he says, even if you want to say that a clock that does display the time is considered measuring, well, the truth is that the whole idea to consider a clock as something as a tool that measures, and therefore it's like a klisha menachta le'isser, like the pen, is not really logically sound. As the Maharil himself said, the only reason we're doing it is because that's the minhag. The Maharil said clearly, look, logically we could say that it's not measuring, but the minhag is to treat it that way. Okay, but the minhag, and we've discussed this a number of times in the past, the minhag is defined by the minhag. The minhag is limited to what the minhag was. The minhag was specifically to sand and shade time, sand watches, sand timers and shade timers, but not to analogs, because analogs didn't exist in the time that the minhag developed. And so perhaps that would be a reason to permit it. So that's what he says to the Panim Iris, and it's actually fun to read inside for those who are able to, because he has some very flowery, poetic language. It was a fun read in the Panim Iris. And so the Panim Iris responds to him, and he says, you're right, and you're even more right than you think you are. Why? So he says, because measuring sand or measuring shade, that's the problem. Our hours, our clocks, they're not doing anything tangible. They're not measuring sand or shade, they're just measuring time. So we already saw in the Maharil that he touched on that at the end. But the way all the poskim quoted the Maharil was, doesn't matter whether you're measuring sand or even if you're measuring something as intangible as time, we still consider it a measuring tool. The Panim Iris, he's not having any of that. And he's saying, no, you really have to go with that last line of the Maharil and take that as primary, that the issue with the clock is that it's measuring the sand. And therefore a clock, like an analog that just displays the time, you're not measuring anything, and therefore it's totally fine, and it's a klisha melachti laheter. And then he says another two words. This is a great tachshit, a great accessory or ornament, which the great people and the aristocrats use. So he seems to be teasing here on another basis to allow the pocket watches, and that is that it's a tachshit. A tachshit means, tachshit literally usually translates as jewelry, but we don't necessarily mean specifically jewelry. It's something that even aristocrats and fancy people wear. So now, whereas until the Maharil is talking about a tool, a device that sits on your table or sits somewhere and it does its thing, this is something because it's part of your outfit. I put on my tie, I put on my tie clip, I put on my pocket watch. So because it's part of your outfit, it's a tachshit, and therefore once it's a tachshit, it's no longer subject to the limitations of a keli, whether it's malach heter or malach iser. A tachshit is certainly going to be permissible.
That would put it into the category of a kli malach iser vela heter, right?
No, I think if I recall,
put it as a tachshit.
So if I recall correct, so I'm not 100% sure of this, I have to check, but if I recall correctly, a tachshit has no limitations at all.
Even if it could be used for a iser.
Correct. Right? Now, that's the Panim Iris, and I quoted the Panim Iris first because he's the most important source on one of the first sources that you have to quote that talks about this. But it's clear that many poskim understood that the reason why everyone is lenient with pocket watches is because it's a tachshit. So the Pri Megadim says that reason, the Aruch HaShulchan says that reason, and many others. And the nafkamina, the practical difference between which reason you take is the heter only for pocket watches or for all clocks? Okay, so let's summarize the story so far. The story so far is that the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, paskins like the Maharil, that the minhag is to treat a clock as a measuring device and therefore as a kli shemalach iser, like the pen. However, in practice, everyone is using the pocket watches on Shabbos without any limitation. Why are they using the pocket watches without any limitation? So some poskim say that the reason everybody's using it is because it's a tachshit, because it's something that's part of your outfit. And some are saying, well, we don't know the reason, or maybe the reason is because it's not measuring anything tangible, it's just measuring time, versus the other ones were measuring sand, etc. Now, of course, there's a very big difference between which approach you take. Because if you say the reason why everyone is being lenient nowadays is because it's a tachshit, well, then that applies to pocket watches and presumably to wrist watches, but it would not apply to a clock, to a table or a wall or any clocks that's not part of your outfit. Versus if you say the reason that, as if you accept the reason of that the Panim Iris seems to be basing himself on, that the primary reason is that the clocks have changed and they're no longer measuring anything tangible, well then that heter, the heter of the Panim Iris, would certainly apply to any type of clock nowadays. Now, any questions so far?
Yeah, because it's still measuring time. Like any kind of watch, it's still measuring.
Right, but the Panim Iris is saying that it doesn't matter if it measures time. If it's not measuring a tangible thing like sand, it's not a problem.
The thing that measures shadows, I think, is a sundial.
It's not. It can't be a sundial because they're referring to something that you move in and out of place. A sundial is a fixed thing, so it's obviously something similar to a sundial, but it's not a sundial.
But there's a secondary. Is that the Panim Iris? It also says the point that it has to be that you're actually doing something.
That was the person who wrote to the Panim Iris. He suggested that.
So Panim Iris does not second that idea.
Well, he doesn't even need that because he's going even more. He's even better than that. Okay, now. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes about this in a number of places. And just for those who are going to be following or looking up the sources, you'll see that the Shari Tshuva misquotes Rabbi Yaakov Emden. In other words, he's referring to what Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes in Muktza, but he quotes it in the name of the Sheilas Yavitz, which is another one of his works. And the reason he makes that mistake is because he's quoting them from a secondary source, which is the Chidah and Machzik Bracha, and the Machzik Bracha quotes two sources, and it seems like the Shari Tshuva just confused those two sources. So, but anyway, it's clear he actually says what the Shari Tshuva says. He just says it in a different. The source, the quotation is off. Anyway, so Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes about this in a number of places, in two places in Sheilas Yavitz and also in Muktza, which is his commentary on the Torah. He actually wrote about it in a fourth place, which he quotes over here, in another sefer of his, something halacha, I forgot the name right now, But that's a sefer of his that, at least to date, was never published. Apparently, the manuscript of it does exist in Columbia or some university. I forget exactly which one, but it's never been published, so we can't look up what he actually says over there. But in Muktza, which is his commentary on the Torah, in the Siman Shin Ches, he says that this is ridiculous. There's no such thing as measuring time. You can measure sand, you can measure things. Measuring time is not a thing, not an issue. But then he says, Klei Shoyos HaGedolos, the big clocks, Klei Shoyos, the tool of hours, the big Klei Shoyos, which are on the boxes on the ground. Okay, the tevis is box, but on the dresser, right? The teva is a dresser or a piece of furniture, right? The bima in the halach is called a teva sometimes, right? So basically, if you have a big clock that's on the a piece of furniture, yesh lahachma betiltul, you should not move them. Im lo lotzerich mekayman, if not only unless if you need the space that they are occupying. Now, at face value, this Rabbi Yaakov Emden is very confusing. First of all, why not? If you're saying that a clock that doesn't measure, that's just measuring time and no sand or anything like that, is not a problem, so why is a big clock a problem? And secondly, there's no such thing as something that's mutar l'tzorech mekayme, but not l'tzorech gufay. If I'm allowed to move it for the space that it occupies, then I'm also allowed to use it for the gufay, to use it, like I said, the pen for scratching your back or as a paperweight. So why is he only saying l'tzorech mekayme and not l'tzorech gufay? So I was trying to figure this out for a long time. And I think then I found that Rabbi Harpenis, in his Sefer Nishma Shabbos, he suggests the following, and I think he's right. This resonates with me. Because he says that if you look, Rabbi Yaakov Emden also has a siddur, and in the siddur, he's also writing sort of practical halachas, and over there he says that Nahagu Isel Ataltul Meirashos, the minhag is to forbid moving the clock, but for the gufay and mekayme, it's permissible. And then he says, V'zegrol shalano, the watches, zegrol, the suffix ul is like, means the small ones, yeah? The small ones, they are permissible to move on Shabbos, as did my father, the Chacham Tzvi, do. By the way, the fact that the Chacham Tzvi used watches on Shabbos is also, the Panamiris also says that the Panamiris was a mechutin with the Chacham Tzvi, and he says, my daughter-in-law, my daughter, who's very intelligent, she told me that in her father-in-law's house they do watches on Shabbos. But then he says, and then he says the same thing, that the big ones that are on the furniture, those ones you shouldn't move. So Rabbi Harpener says, and I think it resonates very well with me, he says two things. First of all, Rabbi Yaakov Emden is making the argument that there's no reason to forbid clocks nowadays that are not measuring something tangible. However, he's not relying on that Lamaisa. Lamaisa, if you ask him what he thinks, yeah, he thinks it's totally fine. But Lamaisa, the minhag in Shulchan Aruch says the minhag is not to do it, so we're not doing it. But the small ones, the pocket ones, those are okay. So that's what he's finishing off. That even though logically this makes no sense, Lamaisa in practice the minhag is to forbid it, so we forbid it. But the small ones, the pocket ones, those are okay, like my father did. But the big ones, the minhag is not to, and therefore you don't.
That's even though the Shulchan Aruch Paskin is based on a different kind of a device that actually was measuring things that are tangible.
Okay, so then you have to ask the question: did Rabbi Yaakov Emden know that? And then, why does he say l'tzorich mekayme? If it's l'tzorich mekayme, it's also l'tzorich gufay. Meaning, if you could move it to the place that it occupies, you could move it l'tzorich gufay as well to use as a paperweight or to tell the time in a different room. So, yeah, you're right. And in the siddur he says beferish gufay mekayme, right? So he's writing shorthand. He's saying l'tzorich mekayme, and we expect you to know that l'tzorich mekayme and l'tzorich gufay go hand in hand. So the bottom line is that Rabbi Yaakov Emden is saying, just one moment. I also found elsewhere in the previous Siman, in Siman Shimon Zayin, in the same Sefer in Muktza, also there he's talking about. He says that the Rambam says that he's quoting the Torah quotes the Rambam about the philosophical works, and he says the philosophers of nowadays should take musa from this, that the greatest philosopher and their crown, the most great of all the sages, the Rambam, even he believed that basically he wasn't into Chachmas Chatzonius on Shabbos. It's like he's not happy with the philosophers. But at the end, in that paragraph, he's saying that therefore this he's talking about an astrolabe, which is a chart or something for the stars. He says that you could only move it l'tzorech mekayme, and it's clear that it means l'tzorech mekayme or l'tzorech gufay. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself uses this shorthand of l'tzorech mekayme to mean both. So it's clear that there's no diuk here of l'tzorech mekayme, not l'tzorech gufay. Now, why am I emphasizing this so much? Because this was really the basis of the whole issue. The whole complication to me came because in the Piskei Teshuvos he says no, that's dafka l'tzorech mekayme, not l'tzorech gufay. So now, one more step in the game is that so let's go back to the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, our watches are permissible, and then he quotes his source is the Pri Megadim, Muktza Shekel, and Shar Achronim. Now, Shar Achronim just means other people, so many poskim say this, fine. Muktza Shekel says, I don't know the reason, and Pri Megadim says the reason is Tachshit. So as far as the Mishnah Berurah is concerned, the primary reason to permit the use of watches on Shabbos is because they are part of your outfit. And then he says, V'dafka aktanim shekerin tashan ur. So only the small ones, which are pocket, which are called tashan ur. Tashan is a pocket in Yiddish, and ur is an hour. So only pocket watches. Aval hagdoilim, but the big ones, and I'm skipping 3 words. Also letaltel, you're not allowed to move them. Even those that are standing on the furniture, the big ones on the furniture, yesh lahachmir bitl tulanim lo tzarich mekayme shari tshuva. The shari tshuva says you should be machmir not to move them unless they are l'tzarich mekayme. Okay, now what is the Mishnah Berurah here has not said anything of his own. He's just quoted the shari tshuva, who's quoting Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Shari tshuva misquotes it from the Sheli Shaiv. It's the Muktza, but it's the same author, and all he said was that the big ones should not be moved if not for l'tzorech mekayme. And as we already established, he doesn't mean l'tzorech mekayme specifically. He means l'tzorech mekayme or l'tzorech gufay, right? So the Piskei Teshuvos is saying, oh, you see, the Mishnah Berurah says l'tzorech mekayme, not l'tzorech gufay, and he builds a whole theory based on that, which I'm not even going to share because I think it makes absolutely no sense. But first of all, your diuk is not in the Mishnah Berurah. Your diuk is in Rabbi Yaakov Emden. The Mishnah Berurah is literally copying and pasting Rabbi Yaakov Emden. That's A. And B, I think it's very well established that Rabbi Yaakov Emden doesn't mean anything by making this diuk of specifically mekayme and not gufay. He would agree that you could move them for either mekayme or gufay, either for the place that it occupies or for using it itself to scratch your back or whatever it is. Now, what are the 3 words that I skipped? The 3 words that I skipped, if it's havagdoirim shakorim vandur. The big ones that are wall clocks, vandor, wall clocks, right? Now, why is the Mishnah Berurah add this? So as far as I could tell, those are the 3 words that are the Mishnah Berurah's innovation. And again, I didn't have a chance to do a deep dive into this, but I'm going to assume that the wall clocks became much more common in the time of the Mishnah Berurah than they were in the time of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, to have a clock that hangs on the wall. Or that stands up against the wall or something like that. And therefore he's stating, which is really stating the obvious, that the wall clocks are similar to the clocks that Rabbi Yaakov Emden talks about that are on the piece of furniture, and they're not similar to the ones that you keep in your pocket. And this is especially true, and in other words, it's especially true that this is obvious, considering the fact that the Mishnah Berurah's point of departure was the Pri Megadim, who says that the basis to be lenient is because it's part of your outfit, not because it's not measuring anything, but because it's part of your outfit. Now, so to summarize, what I'm suggesting over here is that the Mishnah Berurah didn't really say anything innovative over here. All he said was that Shulchan Aruch says we don't use clocks on Shabbos. The minhag is that we do use clocks on Shabbos. The minhag is to be limited only to the small ones that go in your pocket, and all the other ones we remain on the minhag of the Shulchan Aruch, which considers them a klisha malachte le'isser, and they are permissible l'tzoirech gufay or mekaymei. And I'm fairly certain that Reb Chaim Noah learns the same way, because Reb Chaim Noah in Badi HaShulchan in Siman Kuf Ches Sif Katan Gimel, he quotes the Mishnah Berurah, and then he says, well, are you allowed to move a small one that's not a part of the outfit, that's not a tachshit? And he says, okay, either way, it's totally fine. So he's quoting the Mishnah Berurah, and then he's saying that. So it seems clear to me that Reb Chaim Noah understood the Mishnah Berurah the same way I did. And now we move on to wall clocks. It looks like you wanted to ask something. No? Are you, Arya?
I did, but now
Okay, so let's move on. The Chazon Ish has a chiddush in this whole sugya. The Chazon Ish has a question on the Tosfos, and he says that he doesn't understand how Tosfos is comparing a certain thing to Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss. Whoops, I forgot to introduce this. Okay, there's a new type of Muktza. Another type of Muktza that we haven't discussed heretofore is Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss. Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss means something that is designated only for its purpose and you wouldn't use it for anything else. For example, I said before that a pen you could move if you needed to scratch your back, but something that you would not use for anything else other than its designated purpose because you're scared because it could get ruined or whatever it is. So then that's called Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss. Something that's Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss you're not allowed to move at all on Shabbos. Right? What's an example of something that's Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss? One of the examples in halacha is a sheichet's knife. A sheichet would never pull out his knife and use it to cut a piece of chicken, right? It's only used for shechting, right? So therefore, a sheichet's knife is a Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss, and the logic behind it is basically that before Shabbos you had totally no intention of touching this or moving this or having anything to do with it on Shabbos, and therefore remains completely out of bounds. A pen, I didn't have that relationship with it before Shabbos because I knew that even though I can't write on Shabbos, there's a possibility that I'll want to use it to scratch my back or as a paperweight. Whereas a cliche, something that's Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss, before Shabbos came in, it was completely out of my mind. Now, that's the third type of Muktza, the third type of category. We said Kli Shemanachta L'Heser, Kli Shemanachta L'Iser, Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss, and then you have something that's called Muktza, Machmas, Gufay. Muktza, Machmas, Gufay means something that's not a Kli. In other words, before we started out with the word Kli. Kli means, we said, a tool or a functional tool, functional item. Something that's not a Keli, that is not a stone. A stone is nothing. It's not a useful thing. So that is similar to Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss, in that you're not allowed to move it at all on Shabbos. However, there's a big difference between so here's where it gets a little bit complicated. Because on the one hand, the line between Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss and something that's Muktza, Machmas, Gufay, something that's not a Keli at all, can sometimes be blurry. In other words, sometimes it's not. There could be something with. Is it not a useful item, or is it a useful item that I'm not going to be using for anything else? Sometimes that line could be blurred. We'll see soon. However, there is a big nafka mina l'maisa l'chayra. There's a big practical difference, and that is, at least according to some, including the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe holds that something could only become Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss if it's a Kli Shemanachta L'Iser, not if it's a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter. In other words, if you have a pen that's Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss, that means you have a pen that is super fragile and super expensive and super sentimental, let's say, and you would never use it for anything other than signing your signature. You would completely be dysregulated if somebody used it to scratch their back, right?
Like a sofer's pen.
Right, the sofer's pen is actually one of the examples in halacha, exactly. The sofer's pen. If you went into the office of a sofer and took his feather, which he worked for hours to get to be the right shape and size, and you used it to scratch your back, I don't think the sofer would be too happy, right? So that's a Kli Shemanachta L'Iser. It's a forbidden thing. It's for writing. It's also Muktza, Machmas, Chesed, and Kiss. You're makbid not to use it for anything else. So it's completely Muktza. You're not allowed to move it at all. Whereas according to many poskim and according to Alter Rebbe, if something is a klisha malachti leheter, you don't say Muktza machmas chesron kis. So, for example, let's say you have a very fragile cup. You have a cup that's very fragile, and it's not like a plastic cup that you would throw out. Let's say you have a silver cup that's very, very fragile, and you would use it for drinking, but obviously, you treat it with the utmost delicate care, and you would be horrified if somebody used it as a paperweight, right? According to Alter Rebbe, that would not be Muktza machmas chesron kis because it's a klisha malachti leheter. Drinking is permissible on Shabbos, and so because you didn't have it completely out of sight, out of mind before Shabbos, like you would the sheichet's knife, so then it is not Muktza machmas chesron kis, and it's permissible on Shabbos. The exception, according to Alter Rebbe, is something which is oimid l'schayr, meaning if it's in your store and you're going to sell it, so then you would be makbid, and therefore it would be muktzah, even if it's a klisha malachti leheter. The way Rebbe I saw in the Yalkut Yosef, he says, well, then it's a klisha malachti leisur because selling it is forbidden on Shabbos, so this becomes a klisha malachti leisur, which is a cute chap, whatever the case is. All right, now let's talk about our clocks. What happens if you have a clock that is Muktza machmas chesron kis? You have a clock you're very careful not to move it because it could break or get ruined, and you don't want it to break or ruin. So you would not use that clock as a paperweight, right? So is it Muktza machmas chesron kis or not? Well, it depends. According to Alter Rebbe, it depends. If it's a tachshit, if we said the reason why it's permissible, or if it's a type of clock that's part of your outfit, so now it's not a klisha malachti leisur anymore. And so even if it's a super delicate, fragile clock that you're makbid not to move, it would not be Muktza machmas chesron kis. Whereas if you maintain that all clocks are measuring devices, and whereas that is a clock that's part of your outfit, versus a clock that's not part of your outfit, just a table clock, or we'll get to a wall clock in a moment, but let's say a table clock, which is not part of your outfit. So we've said that the minhag seems to be that it's a klisha malachti leisur, with the caveat that maybe there's a whole misunderstanding going on over here, and that's only a clock that measures units of time. The bottom line is, the Achronim certainly seem to be saying that, I don't know if this is the bottom line, but where we're at right now, we're assuming that any type of clock is a klisha malachti leisur, and therefore if it's not a tachshit, if it's not part of your outfit, then it would be subject to the dinim of Muktza machmas chesron kis, and if it was a super fragile clock, it would be forbidden. Why am I talking about fragile clocks? And here we come to the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says that anything that its use is in its place and it's not moved is Muktza machmas gufay. It's not a keli. So he says over there, and this is why the Achronim say that you're not allowed to move the wall that's on the clock, because it's not a keli, it's Muktza machmas gufay. There's no source for this in the Gemara. What's the Chazon Ish saying over here? He's saying that the Achronim forbid using a wall clock. Now, who are the Achronim forbid using a wall clock? The Mishnah Berurah. I didn't find anybody before the Mishnah Berurah who says this, right? So I think he's referring to the Mishnah Berurah. So he's saying, you know why a wall clock is forbidden? A wall clock is forbidden because its use is in its place. It's not moved. You put it there, you don't move it. So because it's not moved, it's even worse than Muktza machmas chesron kis. It's not a keli. It's Muktza machmas gufay is the technical term for it. It's like a stone. It's not subject to. Once something has the status of a keli, of a useful item, yeah. Now you could talk about whether or not you could move it on Shabbos, let's say, gufay, let's say, etc., etc. Something that is not a keli is called Muktza machmas gufay. It's a stone. It has no usage on Shabbos, and you cannot move it on Shabbos under any circumstance. Says the Chazon Ish, something that it's on the wall and it's just fixed in place right over there, and you never move it, and its usage is just to look at it in its place, you have absolutely no intention of ever moving it on Shabbos, and therefore it's completely Muktza machmas gufay, and it's completely forbidden. Now, yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying that it's even if a wall clock has a use, which is to tell the time by looking at it, and a rock doesn't have any use in Shabbos. The logic is the same. That when going into Shabbos, your mind is completely removed from the rock because it doesn't have any use on Shabbos. It's not a kli. It doesn't have tangible, useful things that you do with it. The wall clock is also, when you're going into Shabbos, there's no intention that you're ever going to move that as some kind of device you're going to use throughout your house. You're only going to have one particular purpose, which means remaining on the wall. So the svara, the logic behind the two should be the same, and whatever svara you're going to say about a rock, you're also going to say about the wall.
Pretty much, yeah. Now, the Chazon Ish is tremendously mechudesh. First of all, he himself seems to be saying that Tosfos wouldn't agree with this. He has a Tosfos, and he says, I don't understand why Tosfos says this. And then he says, Luli Divrei, if not for Tosfos, I would say such and such. So he seems to be acknowledging himself that what he's saying is in contradiction to Tosfos. And secondly, and here's the more important thing, is that even if you accept the argument of the Chazon Ish, I find it difficult to accept that that's what the Mishnah Berurah means. Because the Mishnah Berurah says explicitly, first of all, because the Mishnah Berurah says explicitly that you are allowed to move the wall clock if you need the space. And if you hold it's Muktza machmus chesrin kis, or it's Muktza machmus gufay, that it's like a stone and you can't move it at all, then it would be forbidden in tzorich mekaymai. So perhaps the Chazon Ish is not talking about the Mishnah Berurah, and he found some other achronim who say that you're not allowed to move a wall clock at all on Shabbos. But the achronim who I know that talk about a wall clock are the Mishnah Berurah and possibly Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He's not specifically talking about a wall clock; he's talking about a clock on a piece of furniture. But the idea is a clock that doesn't ever usually get moved; it just stays put. And another thing, and they both say that it's a kli shebalachti le'isur, and you are allowed to move it l'tzorich mekaymai. So even if the Chazon Ish is entitled to his own opinion, but I don't think I don't think you could make the argument that that's what the Mishnah Berurah means. And again, I'm getting to this because the Piskei Teshuvos, which is what got me into this whole trouble to begin with, he completely conflates the Chazon Ish with the Mishnah Berurah. And he says that Chazon Ish is talking about Muktza machmus chesrin kis, which he's not. He's talking about Muktza machmus gufay. And again, the difference might not be, the line between them might be somewhat blurry, but there is a difference. So, b'meila, the bottom line is that, so far, that, okay, let's summarize everything we've said so far. Everything we've said so far is like this. Number one, Shulchan Aruch says the minhag is to treat a keli, a watch, a clock, a time-telling device, as a measuring tool, and therefore it's like a pen, a kli shemalachti le'isur. However, all the poskim say that when it comes to that nowadays we're lenient. Why are we lenient nowadays? So the primary reason that the poskim rely on is because it's a tachshit, because it is part of your outfit, and therefore it's forbidden, and therefore it's completely permissible. But a watch that's not part of your outfit, a wall clock, a table clock, or anything like that, would be a kli shemalachti le'isur, which again would still be allowed to be moved l'tzorich gufay or mekaymai.
That's the general practice now?
Yes. Now, no. Hold on. One second. Now, if it would be a very expensive, the Vart is not so much expensive. If it would be a clock that I'm careful that I don't do anything with it, I would never use it as a paperweight or to crack a nut because I'm scared it's going to get ruined or whatever. Yeah. So then it would be. Would it be subject to Muktza machmus chesrin kis? According to Alter Rebbe, that would depend on whether or not it's a kli shemalachti le'isur or kli shemalachti le'heter. And so, I guess we're saying the minhag is to treat it like a kli shemalachti le'isur, so that would be a problem. The Chazon Ish seems to be of the opinion that any clock that's fixed in place and you don't usually move it is Muktza machmus gufay. And again, there are definitely those poskim who argue on the Chazon Ish, and I don't think it's feasible to say that the Mishnah Berurah would agree with that, even though I see that Piskei Teshuvos and other contemporary books say that the Mishnah Berurah does agree with that. I don't think that is a feasible argument in the Mishnah Berurah, because he says explicitly, as does Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that the tzorich mekaymai, it would be permissible. Now, I guess you could also make the argument, which helped us earlier, which could now come back to bite us, There were those who wanted to say, look, I think the Nissen Karelitz and Chotashoni makes this argument, maybe. Akavemden himself made the argument that looking at it is not a usage. You're looking at it, like that's not a usage. So you could say that, yeah, you could move the clock l'serich gufay if you're using it as a paperweight, but to tell the time, that's not l'serich gufay. That's nothing. That's not a tangible thing. So I could hear such an argument. Now, Steve is asking, is this the bottom line? Bottom line. So there's one more wrench to throw in this wheel, and that is Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So in the Sefer Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa, he writes that. Okay, one second. Before I say this, there's another question. If you're saying that the reason why a pocket watch is mutter is because it's a part of your outfit, it's a tachshit, is that true of let's say, like one of those cheap Casio watches with a black strap, right? As far as wearing it on Shabbos in the street, it would not be considered a tachshit. I'm talking without an eruv, right? So is that considered a tachshit or not? You could say no, like that's not. You're not wearing it as part of your outfit. You're wearing it because it's a tool. The most convenient, instead of holding the tool in your pocket, you're putting the tool on your wrist. It's more convenient. You could say that. Or you could say no. You could say a wristwatch is a tachshit, even if you don't consider it a tachshit for carrying outside on Shabbos. Huh?
Make sure the camera.
Yeah. Even though you could differentiate and say that the barometer for what's considered a tachshit for carrying on Shabbos is not necessarily the same as what's considered a tachshit for Muktza, Zol Zayin Hazoi. Let's see what he says. He says in Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa, he says that all watches nowadays, hand watches, etc., are permissible on Shabbos. Ein Muktza mutar l'taltalam. Showing the hand watch, a wristwatch, showing case, a pocket watch, showing an alarm clock, whether they're mechanical or with batteries, totally fine to move them on Shabbos. What's this based on? So in the bottom he quotes Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in the Sefer Meirei Eish. I looked up the Meirei Eish, and here's what Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes. Says the clocks that were used in previous generations could go like the sand timers. They only used these devices while they were doing some sort of work. Like if you were in a factory or a pharmacy, a factory. You were in the lab. Steve, you've been to a lab before? Yeah? So in the lab, things have to be very precise. And if it's supposed to be 10 minutes and you leave it there for 12 and a half minutes, it's going to fail your experiment and then you're going to sue the company. Right? Steve is nodding his head. Fine? The Chavina says, they had to make the exact time. Etc. Whereas nowadays, he's paraphrasing that, nobody doesn't have a time. Nobody doesn't. In other words, everybody keeps time and everybody's doing everything they do based on the time. In other words, we don't only use time for very specific experiments in the lab. We run our life around the clock, right? So nowadays, even when I'm not doing a malacha, I'm still telling time and caring about the time and on a need-to-know basis of what time it is, right? So therefore, nowadays, measuring time is no longer considered a weekday type of activity, and therefore all watches are permissible, and they're a klisha malach lehater. Now, I think that this needs to be further fleshed out. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is certainly entitled, and Bar Hachi, he's got broad shoulders. He could say such a thing. I think that we might be able to nitpick about whether his logic is 100% convincing. But like I said, there could be other reasons to differentiate, like I started off with. It could be that the whole thing is really a little bit of a misnomer and the whole thing was only about measuring units of time, or about, I saw in the Rabbi Yaakov Reisha in Shuvas Yaakov, Chelik Gimel Chavav, he says that the whole issue with the clock was nothing to do with measuring, it's because clocks made a noise, and therefore even the clocks that didn't make a noise, you make a gzeira because you might, if you use that type of clock, you use that type of clock. So logically, we could come up with numerous reasons to say that what it says in Shulchan Aruch about the minhag to clocks doesn't apply nowadays, and therefore all clocks nowadays are a klisha melachte leheter, and the practical ramifications would be number one, that I could move the clock even l'torech atzmai, meaning if my clock is outside in the rain and it's going to get ruined, I could bring it in. And number two, it would mean, according to the Alter Rebbe, it's not subject to Muktza, Machmas, Ches, and Kiss. and therefore, even if it was something I was very careful about, perhaps I would still be allowed to move it. Bottom line, I don't yet have. Meaning, are we completely comfortable dismissing the Chazon Ish's Chiddush as being not relevant and not mainstream? I'm not 100% sure about that. My inclination is that yes, that the Chazon Ish is a big Chiddush, and I mean, if somebody wants to be machmer like the Chazon Ish, that's totally fine. But I don't. My inclination is to say that the Chazon Ish is a tremendous Chiddush, and it's not something that can be mechayev everyone. But I'm not 100% comfortable saying that. At the end of the day, there is a logic to say, look, the clock is on the wall. I never take it off the wall unless I'm going to twice a year change the clock, unless you live in Arizona, or maybe to change the battery once every 5 years. So I had no intention whatsoever, and so logically I can somewhat compare it to a stone. I'm not sure about that. And finally, I'm leaving the caveat open to say that maybe with some more deeper research as to the different types of clocks and devices that were available and known to the various poskim, we would be able to get a little bit more into the depths and the clarity of exactly who's who and what's what. And so, if said individual would once again knock on my door on Friday night and say, "Can I move the clock?" What would I tell him? So what I would tell him is like this: I'm fairly certain that you can, but I'm not 100% sure. But I have another eitzah for you. That is that according to the Alter Rebbe, according to most poskim, and according to Alter Rebbe, you can move any Muktza kelachayat. So you could pick up the clock in an unusual way, like this, and move it into your room. And that way, even if you consider the clock to be Muktza machmas chesron kis, like a stone, if you move it kelachayat, it would be totally permissible, certainly according to the Alter Rebbe. And therefore, if it would happen again, that's what I would tell the person to do. Thank you all for joining.
The Alter Rebbe